Hello and welcome back to another update where I cover the latest developments throughout the front line in the Russo-Ukrainian war. It is your host Kupyansk, and in this one the Russians continue their offensive operations across the eastern section of the front line, storming the city of Pokrovsk itself, storming the remaining parts of Chasiv Yar, gaining 100% full control over the city. The Russians continued offensive operations to the northeast of Pokrovsk and in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, with additional advances in the direction of Kupyansk to the east of the town. Starting out in the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region, the Russians continued offensive operations to the northeast of Zelenopole, gaining control over several fortified positions here to the west of Zelenopole and Shevchenko. Gaining control of these fortified positions is part of the Russian operations to gain full control over the southwestern outskirts of the Donetsk region and to storm the second line of defense of the Zaporizhzhia defensive lines from the eastern direction. The Russians have already captured Melivka to the north and Temerivka to the south, clearing the flanks for a push towards Pomyshuvacha, gaining control over which will allow the Russians to start fighting over the second line of defense and the settlements to the north of this second line of defense with the southern flank covered, and for further advances along the first line of defense, gaining control over it by flanking it from the rear, the weak points, and from the side along the main road. The Russian objective here is to do a wide push from the south of the Vovcha line here in the northern flanks and all the way to the first line of defense in the south. This wide advance along the fortified positions from the rear and from their sides is the largest advantage the Russians can get through these fortified areas. To the north of this, the Russians advance here to the west of Pidokne and the direction of Andreyevka-Klevtsove, securing the northern flank of these fortified positions and continuing the advance along the first line of defense here north of Oleksandrorad. Russians are here working on getting control over the Vovcha River line along the border area between the Donetsk and Dnipropetrovsk region. Before pushing down towards Oleksandrorad, the Russians need to gain control over the fortified positions and Andreyevka-Klevtsove, cutting off the road connecting the Ukrainian forces across the river lines, the Kamyanka river line and the Vovcha river line, as well as the fortified positions in that direction. Establishing a defensive line for the Russians allows them to defend against the Ukrainian forces here in the northwestern parts, and then push down towards Oleksandrorad along the Vovcha river line and push further towards Shishneve and Vorona, and then down towards the rear of the fortified positions along the second line of defense. In the direction of Pokrovsk, the Russians continue storming the city. We see the geolocated footage here, which was released on the 27th of July. We see based on this footage, the Russians were present within the central parts of the city. Then there's this geolocated footage from the 30th of July, which was released on that date. It is not clear whether the footage was taken on that date, though. Again, Russian soldiers operating within the central parts of the city. Both of these locations are close to each other. One is to the northwest and the other is to the east. Both of these locations are areas where the Russians have not been able to entrench themselves yet. The areas where the Russians can entrench themselves and establish a base is along the apartment complex areas, which we can see right next to the first image. The Russians were fighting right next to it. This either means that they have established themselves within the apartment complex areas and were expanding outwards from it, or that they are establishing themselves on the apartment complex areas and are fighting towards it. In either case, based on this geolocated footage, it is not clear which route the Russians are using to enter Pokrovsk, whether it is through the southwestern micro-districts, the Shakhtarsky district to the southeast, or through the forest patch areas, meaning they have captured Troyanda. It is not clear which route they use to enter, how they supply their forces, but the fact is that the Russians have now been present within Pokrovsk for many days, despite the deep state map claiming that they have gotten rid of them. So we see the Russians continue to operate within the city, at the heart of the city. And with this video here, we see a panorama over the city, where we first see this zigzag bridge over the railway, which shows that it is from the Ukrainian side that this drone is flying. We see it zooms in on some areas where there's clear evidence of street fighting, as well as some destroyed buildings from shelling, but the majority of the buildings are still standing. The apartment complex areas in the rear are even mostly well off. There are some that have seen clear strikes from FAB bombs, the smaller kinds of 250 or 500 pounds. We also see the church standing with no issue. The administrative building is completely destroyed though. From this we see that fighting is taking place not just along the first initial areas, but also the railway area and the church area, the apartment complex areas. So several areas of the front line further north in the central parts and along the railway area has seen a lot of fighting between the Russian and Ukrainian forces. But again, the main fighting is taking place in the Shahtarsky district, which has a lot of apartment complex area and fortified positions, making it the heart of the defense of Pokrovsk. If the Russians capture it, it will be the heart of the capture of Pokrovsk. To the northeast of the city, the Russians have captured the town of Mayak, reaching the outskirts of Pengivka and fighting over the fortified positions to the northwest of the town. Russians are slowly advancing to the rear of Volodymyrivka along the western bank of the river line, cutting off the supplies to the town, as they've already been operating to the north of the town. Cutting them off from the western direction will cut off the remaining supplies and completely encircle Volodymyrivka with a river line to the west and a river line to the north, as they continue pushing in the northern direction and clear the road for additional pushes towards the western direction for future offensive operations towards Dobropilya as well as Rodinsk on the northern flank of Pokrovsk. As we can see, there are several supply lines that leads into Pokrovsk, the one near Rodinsk towards the eastern outskirts of Pokrovsk, and the Dnieper highway, which goes to the western parts of Pokrovsk. If the Russians are able to cut off the northern supply road near Rodinsk, then the Ukrainians could only supply through the western flank near Ryshine and the Dnieper highway. With that, the Ukrainians would need to move through Pokrovsk itself to supply Milnorad and the frontline positions. This means if the Russians are able to cut off the supply lines there, and with activity in the central parts of the city, they'll be able to stop the majority of the logistics moving into the Milnorad and frontline positions. This means the Russians are here working not to capture the city of Pokrovsk within the activity that is deep inside the city. Instead, it is likely to stop the supplies that goes through the Dnieper highway, and at the same time to establish some forward positions, potentially build up some reconnaissance or supplies for when the follow-up assaults come, where the Russians are actually looking to gain control of the city. This is likely following the capture of the Shahtarsky district and the southern parts of the city. Moving on to the eastern section of the front line, the Russians advance in the direction of Chasiv Yar, gaining 100% full control over the city. Russians have now captured the forest area in the central parts of it, as well as the southern district. With this, the Russians have 100% full control over Chasiv Yar, following several years of fighting. The Ukrainians managed to reorganize themselves within Mykolaiivka for some counterattacks, contesting the town. With this, the Russians are now going to be working on gaining control over the areas surrounding Chasiv Yar. With full control over the city, they're now able to build up forces and supplies within it for further offensive operations. The main axis of advance will likely be along the railway in the direction of Popasna and Vyrolyubivka to gain control over the northern flank of Kostiantynivka, as well as fighting over Mayske, Markova and Novomarkova at the northern flank of the city, and then push onwards towards Mykolaiivka, Chervone and Predyshine in the south. And with this, the Russians will achieve operational encirclement of Kostiantynivka from the north. Following the capture of the city, it is only a matter of time before the Russians achieve these additional advances, combined with the Russians gaining control over Yablonivka to the south and the fighting reaching its end stage in the direction of Poltava and Rusinyar. The Russians will be looking to gain control over the four settlements on the western flank of Kostiantynivka for the full operational encirclement of the city, to which the Russians can start fighting over Kostiantynivka as well, where the main axis of attack will likely be from the southeast through the western flank of Donetsk along the urban areas all the way up to Kostiantynivka and through Oleksandro-Shultine, as well as the railway area between the two sectors. potentially also through the Chasiv Yar direction, where the Russians will have the high ground advantage. The Russians will be able to storm Kostyantynivka from several directions with their geographical advantages, while the Ukrainians have strong defenses with their fortifications built. In the eastern flank of Kupyansk, the Russians continue offensive operations here to gain control of additional fortified positions and move in the direction of Pyshane, following the capture of fortified positions here to the southwest of Po and Novoselivka. With this, the Russians are slowly advancing towards the Oskar River line, where they're pressuring the settlements of the Ukrainians on the eastern bank. The Russians are storming Kupyansk from the north, where they're looking to gain control over the town, establishing themselves within the outskirts of it and then gaining full control of it. The Ukrainians have a lot of forces in the area, so they're constantly launching counterattacks to secure the positions and prevent a Russian capture of it, as that would lead to the encirclement of the Ukrainian forces operating to the east of the Oskar River line. The Russians are at the same time storming the eastern parts of the Oskar River line to keep the Ukrainian forces from withdrawing across the river line and to keep them on the eastern bank. When the Russians capture Kupyansk, if the Ukrainians are on the eastern bank of the Oskar River line, a large grouping of the forces would be encircled. If they are on the western bank, then it will further delay the capture of Kupyansk, and the Russians will not get as much from it. This means the quicker the Russians capture Kupyansk, the better, while at the same time storming the positions to the south, north, and east of the pocket here in the eastern bank of the Oskar River line will allow the Russians to gain the most possible success from the capture of the town, which will then allow them to establish a logistical hub on the western bank of the Oskar River line. Combined with the Varishna and Kamyanke, the Russians will be able to have 3 logistical hubs across the Oskar River line and then start offensive operations towards Shevchenko and the northern direction for activity on the western bank of the Oskar River line for the first time in 3 years. And that is going to be all for this update. Thank you for watching. Make sure to leave a like, subscribe, check out my Patreon and YouTube membership for additional content, and make sure to check out my video where I covered the Russian summer offensive, the first phase, and the logistical hubs that the Russians looking to gain control of. And see you all next time.